As promised, here is the Cyclox Mark II single-digit Nixie clock. I assembled the kit that I received from Insidious Nixies. Thanks again to him for very generously sending me this clock and several other clocks and parts. I did an unboxing video of that package in my previous video, so go check that out if you want to see it. But here's the finished clock. Since this clock only has one Nixie tube, it has to display the time sequentially. So 0309 is 309. It doesn't blink the leading zero. The dome is a real piece of glass, and the base is nicely machined from a single piece of wood, which was then finished. The clock came with a piece of green felt to put on the bottom, but I was worried that it would slide off the top of whenever I put it on too easily, so I decided to go with rubber feet instead. I of course saved that piece of felt though. Here's the user manual and the certificate of authenticity that came with it. He put the manufacturing date of the tube on there. It's also stamped on the back. That's presumably where he read it from. The clock itself was packed on the 17th of December 2007, and we're now in March of 2023, so the clock has been sitting a while. But the long wait is now over, and the clock is working great, thankfully. It wasn't too difficult to assemble. It only took me one evening, because there really aren't that many components. Despite the relative simplicity of the clock and its few components, the manual is quite detailed, much more detailed than you'd get with a clock kit from China. I'm not going to go over every page in detail because there's a lot of them, but I will flip through at least most of it. Give some history of Nixie tubes, some history of his clock kits, and some details about this one, of course. Some general warnings and circuit descriptions. The PIC processor really does all the heavy lifting on this clock. It even takes care of generating the high voltage supply. You could get this clock with either the big IN-18 tube or a little IN-8-2 tube. Thankfully, the original purchaser opted for the larger IN-18 tube. It makes a much stronger impression. So here's the tube pinouts and the specifications. It would seem that IN-18 tubes last quite a bit longer than 5,000 hours. They can last many years if they're not being horribly overdriven or underdriven, which would lead to cathode poisoning. So now it's getting into the construction section. This section is also well done. Here's the parts list. You can see there's not all that many parts, it's just one little page here. The power cord on this thing was very, very generous. Not only was the cord on the adapter fairly long, it also came with a very long extension. It said just to cut off the end, but I actually ended up cutting off and saving quite a bit longer section than this because I don't need like 30 feet of cord on this thing. I left it still quite long. There's probably about 20 feet or so there with it all stretched out, maybe 15, but still that's way more than enough. Setting the clock is pretty easy. You just hold down the... Ooh, you gotta watch your fingers there though. Just hold down the hours or minutes button. It does display the time in 24-hour time when you're setting it. So it might be a little confusing to those of you more used to 12-hour time, including me. But it's pretty intuitive. So now it's set to 10 p.m. You can change the minutes in the same way. Just hold it down and it'll display the minutes. You can see them going up. The neon here is a little bit odd. I'm not sure I would have used it in the way it's being used. It basically just blinks out the seconds, but it doesn't really do it in sync with the tube. Kind of would rather it light up only when the minutes are being displayed, or only when the hour is being displayed, or something like that. Because I mean, you know the clock is running when it's flashing. One other unusual feature of the clock, and this one I'd say makes sense for a single-digit clock, is that he's using a parameter table to set all the other features. So instead of setting each one of these parameters individually, you find the row in this table here that corresponds to all the parameter settings that you want, and then you enter just that number into the parameters menu, which you get to by holding down the hours and minutes buttons for a little bit, and then you can enter it with the minutes switch, and then you hold down the hours switch to get out of that menu. I forget what I have it set to. I think it's this one though, number 9. You gotta do it while it's not blinking. It's a little tricky. This is why I didn't want to get back into that menu, because it's a pain. I will say that could be a little bit easier. I've now selected option 10, which is basically the same as 9, except for the display goes a bit faster. I have tried the chimes options, but chime's a bit obnoxious. It's not the most musical chime, since it's coming out of a little piezo beeper in there. Plus I already have a chiming clock on my fridge, so don't need a second one going off at the same time. Here's the circuit diagram. It's kind of impressive how much he managed to simplify this thing down. As I mentioned before, the microprocessor controls the high voltage supply, so it has to pulse width modulate this FET here. Then it has a voltage divider, which it uses for feedback to determine what the voltage is. It does a pretty good job of that. Although I'm still not a huge fan of this sort of setup, which is pretty common on Nixie tube clocks, just because it saves on a part. The issue is that the microprocessor freezes while the FET is switched on. That's basically a short circuit across the power supply, and it can burn up the board. So that's obviously not a good thing if that does happen. And there is no fuse on this one, actually. Although I'm sure something would give, either the bridge rectifier or, I don't know, maybe the FET. Well, it is a pretty beefy FET. Might be one of the later things to fail. Hopefully that won't happen. I like how the back of the manual displays the back of the clock. The other things in that little envelope are the piece of felt that I opted not to use. It is very smooth felt. I was worried it would slide off the table, so I decided to go with those rubber feet instead. Here's a reprint of the datasheet for the IN-18 tube. He even printed it on yellow paper. That was a nice addition. Here's the packing list, and that's it. It's a nice little clock, and it's got a place of pride on top of my fridge. Alright, thanks for watching.